This is a channeled message. I don't know who it's for, so I am just gonna post it without really explaining too much more because I don't know what to explain. The message is that your dream is true. The dream you had is real. It's common for you to have dreams that are just processing the thoughts you had throughout the day. But it's very different. When people go into REM sleep, deep sleep, they actually are retreating into their minds. They're not going into a higher spiritual world for the most part. It's, in fact, I can confidently say that that's never what's happening. When someone is in REM sleep, they are experiencing memories, thoughts they had during the day that were incomplete thoughts, and your mind is sorting out whether or not they are relevant to anything or valuable in some way, if they're useful thoughts. So you kind of cycle through a bunch of material, and your mind will get creative and kind of play and experiment with different ideas that you had, and none of that is anything like the shared material reality that you have with other people when you're consciously awake. um I guess it's similar in a way because you're thinking and your mind is experiencing something. Your consciousness is actually experiencing something when you're in REM sleep. You're not just offline, and it's not a malfunction or anything like that. But in this channeled message, I'm talking about something different, which is right before you wake up or right as you're falling asleep, when you're actually not in REM sleep. Your mind is active, but there's still a conduit from your mental and physical reality to the spiritual reality that you are always in. What's happening when you fall into REM sleep is you actually have appointed spiritual guardians that stand watch while your mind is sort of absent from conscious reality, and that stops your body from being taken over. It's actually impossible while you're in REM sleep to have your body be doing anything else because of that. But when you're in that twilight sleep where your mind is active but you're not awake and you're not falling into REM dream sleep yet, you are susceptible to influences. There can be people who are trying to psychically communicate with you, and there can be spiritual entities who can interact with you and it on the mental level. So they're using a conduit from the spiritual world to interact with you mentally, which they can do when you're consciously awake as well. But what's happening is you're no longer conscious, so your subconscious mind is still active. So sometimes you notice things or realize things, and it's almost like your consciousness is now looking inward on itself and trying to find its bearings and decide if it's safe or not to fall into REM sleep, is the best way to put it. So this particular channeled message is for someone who was wondering if an entity that was standing in the doorway, I don't know, my doorway might differ from yours, but somehow there's a doorway that was in a dream you remembered. But this dream was not a true dream. It was twilight sleep, and you were actually using your imagination. And you might be aware of that because the original thought was you were looking at the doorway and laying in bed, and you knew that you were somewhat either waking up or falling asleep. I don't know, but you were in that twilight sleep mentality where you were starting to no longer be conscious, but you looked at the doorway. So you you felt like your eyes were open and you were looking at the doorway. And then you used your imagination to wonder if it would be safe if somebody stood in the doorway and came and looked at you, if you would be safe. So you were on the right track. You were thinking a valid thought and you were using your own imagination while you were in that state. But the channeled message is that that was not a real entity. When you started to imagine someone standing in the doorway, you then had a vivid dream about someone actually standing in the doorway. And you stood up from your sleep and walked over to the doorway, and your legs weren't really working correctly. You stepped through the doorway, and there was no longer anyone else in the doorway but you, and you stumbled somewhat. And then you woke up a little bit more and realized that you're like, oh, that was a dream. I'm still lying in bed. In fact, your eyes never opened. When you looked at the doorway, you were essentially using your imagination to completely recreate what you would see if you had opened your eyes right at that moment. And that's not too difficult to imagine. So it seemed completely real. And what you were doing is having essentially an out of body experience. So you astrally projected, and this often happens if you deliberately or accidentally astral project. The first place you see when you go into the realm of thought is that it it's exactly the the place where you physically are. So if you sat down and meditated and you tried to astral project out of your body, your first awareness is that you're in the same exact room where you were meditating, because there's a mental and spiritual reality too. So those are, your mind knows that that's where um your your mental and spiritual selves are, is that they are physically in that space. But in this particular dream that you had, what you actually were doing is using your imagination, because you were wondering what it would be like for some reason if someone were standing in that doorway. Maybe you were worried that the door was open. Maybe you didn't want someone to be standing there, and you were trying to reassure yourself like you would be able to get up and stop someone or interact with them in some way. Or maybe you were just absently wondering. But whoever this channeled message is for, this was a stranger to you at the time. So it wasn't someone who you recognize or know. And as soon as you stood up out of the bed, I guess it's a bed or a couch or something you were laying on, and walked towards the doorway, you forgot all about imagining someone standing in the doorway, because you were so distracted by how strange it was when you were walking. You were sort of floating towards the doorway, and then when you started to be like aware of your legs walking, they didn't work correctly, so you knew something was amiss. And as it didn't seem logical to you that you would look down and there were no legs there. And when that happened, you felt the sensation of sort of stumbling or walking awkwardly, almost like you were drunk and couldn't control your limbs. And you had already passed through the doorway, so you turned somewhat to look back at the bed, but you couldn't see because you had already walked through the doorway. And you started to realize that this is a dream, it's not real. And then suddenly you were right back in your body lying in bed. And what I'm getting as part of the channeled message is that you didn't even open your eyes. You didn't immediately open your eyes, at least if you were waking up fully. But if you weren't waking up fully, this might have been a thought you were having while you were falling asleep. But it's much more likely, I'm getting, that it's when you were about to wake up. So then you actually got up and went and did something. Did you make tea or go use the restroom? Something like that. I'm not sure. But when you were actually conscious after that, you did briefly remember the dream. So I'm calling it a dream, but it definitely was distinct and different from an REM sleep dream. And that is maybe a topic for another time, of the difference between those two types of dreams. But this was much more like a conscious imagination. And when you thought about an entity being in the doorway and an entity appeared in the doorway, that was actually an imaginary construct. It was a lot more like a tulpa or an imaginary friend. And this channeled message is just to reassure you that there wasn't any outside party trying to psychically connect with you or spiritually invade your mind or anything like that, because that crossed your mind. It wasn't a demon, it wasn't a ghost, anything like that. This was just an imaginary friend that you essentially invented right in that moment because you were thinking about that. The significant spiritual thing that happened was that you astrally projected successfully. So stop worrying about whether or not that was some kind of dangerous or scary entity or interesting spiritual being communicating with you. You're on the wrong track when you're thinking about that. The significant thing that you are supposed to take away from that experience is that astral projecting is easier than you thought. Look how easy you did it. The person who this channeled message is meant for doesn't really have experience with astral projection, or at least hasn't successfully astral projected before. And now you know what it feels like. So it's the reason that you remembered that when you fully woke up is because you were meant to make a note of that experience, because you need to be able to astral project for some reason. It's an important thing that your higher self wants you to do. That's the channel message. Thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you.